OES acknowledges the traditional owners of the lands on which we work, teach and learn. We acknowledge First Nations peoples and the important contributions that they make to education and learning.
Flexibility in my studies to me means having the ability to choose, whether that be the times that I have my classes or the delivery method, just being able to work around the other commitments that I have in my life is really important. And if I was not able to do that, then I think my studies would definitely suffer.
Achieving a good work-life study balance has been one of the aspects of university that has been most challenging for me. It's really important for me to have downtime and spend time with friends and do the things that I love to do. And that's why I've really had to focus on my organisational skills. And because of that, at times it has been really difficult to keep going and want to study when I have all these other commitments. However, relying on the people around me, relying on my network, outreaching for support when I need that support has been really beneficial for me to maintain that work-life study balance.
Hello, and welcome back to The Thought Bubble. I'm Amanda Ford from Online Education Services, and in this episode, we're turning to one of the most persistent and often unhelpful debates in higher education: online versus on-campus learning. In episode 1, we argued that the real challenge is not how to prevent misconduct, but how to evidence learning across a whole program over time. In this episode, we take that same question and apply it to modality. Rather than asking, is online safe or is on campus more secure, we would argue that a more helpful question is, can the learning journey be deliberately designed and governed to generate credible, connected evidence of learning over time? Mode has always been treated as a key distinguisher in the assurance of learning debate, as if physical location on its own is the silver bullet for assurance. But risk does not map neatly onto online, hybrid, and on-campus labels. By focusing on modality, we risk missing where the real opportunity for assurance of learning actually sits. That matters because if institutions or regulators respond to AI by falling back on narrow assumptions about mode, they risk compliance optics instead of actual evidence quality. At OES, this matters deeply because we work at the intersection of quality, flexibility, and participation. Our partners serve large and diverse student cohorts where participation depends on flexibility due to work, caring responsibilities, geography, disability, and career transition.
I think one of the things for me in terms of flexibility in real life has probably been, I kind of always wish I had the ability to go to a different time of lecture each week, given that's like my only touch point. If I have something else on that week at that particular time, kind of cuts me out.
The real assurance question isn't whether a single task works, but whether programs are intentionally designed so that these kinds of assessments build a connected body of evidence over time.
I think the use of the online tools and quizzes and all that kind of material that's sort of done at your own time and leisure, I think that stuff obviously creates a great level of flexibility, and I can do it remotely, I can do it kind of from anywhere. So that part is excellent.
In that context, flexibility is not a convenience feature. It's often the condition that makes participation possible. And that means assurance models that equate confidence too closely with physical presence risk excluding capable students without necessarily improving what institutions can actually know about learning or strengthening the quality of evidence they rely on. The real difference between stronger and weaker assurance is not where learning happens, but whether programs are designed to generate observable, trustworthy evidence over time. Modality-based assumptions can drive blunt and inequitable responses, narrowing flexibility for students who rely on online provision to participate at all.
Personally, I live over an hour away from my university, so I only go in 2 days a week. And I think not going in every day, not having that sort of social aspect really affects what you take out of university. I think it's hardest because we can no longer afford to not work. So at the moment, I'm working 2 days a week, but you've got to make sacrifices. Some weeks when university is really intense, I have to cut back on work, but this is the life of a student.
For many students, flexibility is what allows rigorous participation. But for that flexibility to be credible, institutions need to show how learning outcomes are mapped, how parity is maintained, how progression is monitored, and how evidence is built across time. This isn't a story about mode. It's a story about how assessment design, when it's part of a coherent program, can make learning visible in more meaningful ways. Well-designed, connected program architecture can provide more credible assurance than reliance on isolated, high-stakes events alone. That is the argument at the heart of this episode. To explore that, I'm joined by two of our academic partnership leaders here at OES, Dr. Wijeratne and Dr. Karen Harvey. They bring complementary perspectives to the same challenge. Aaron approaches modality as a designed environment, examining how active asynchronous learning structures, course maps, governance arrangements, and data can generate a connected trail of evidence for assurance of learning across large-scale online programs. Karen brings the complementary student life cycle and equity lens, how those same design and governance choices land for career changers, working adults, and other non-traditional learners, and how institutions can close the loop between design intent and student outcomes through feedback, support, and data. Together, they shift the question from, is online safe? To, is this program designed and governed in ways that generate credible, connected evidence of learning? So let's start there. Here's the conversation with Aaron and Karen.
Hi, Karen. So the first question I guess we're talking through today is, when we talk about modality in 2026, what do we mean and why does it matter for genuinely assuring learning online? My view of this is that in 2026, modality is no longer about location, it's a designed environment. We're at a point where quality is not tied to a physical space, but is a function of the design of our learning programs, the support we offer students, and the governance that sits outside all of this.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Aaron. It's not about geography anymore, online versus on campus. It's about how that learning shows up in the student's life. So for a 40-something career changer, potentially working full-time, part-time, caring for kids or parents, modality is about whether that degree can fit into the realities of their week, but without asking them to lower their ambition or their standards. Mm-hmm. So for me, if you're talking about the online environment, assurance of learning matters more in that context.
I think that we've seen substantial shifts over the past few years into online. Some of those were rushed. We start to move past the online versus in-class rhetoric by showing that quality is driven by how learning is intentionally architectured. But this is not a debate where it's about a proxy for quality. It's that quality is a function of design and governance. Whether a student is in a lecture theatre or a digital environment, the institution's responsibility to evidence learning remains the same. I guess very similarly, I think what we need to see from an industry perspective is that we need to shift towards program level design, where every asynchronous and synchronous touch point is a deliberate data point for evidence. The second point is to use that governance and data as central tools to monitor parity and quality across all delivery modes. I think this will start to move the dial on that debate between on-campus versus online, because it is the data and the evidence that will ensure that the quality of the educational experience is validated.
Why does it matter whether we can genuinely assure learning online?
Because I think we've been stuck in focusing on the where. And when we focus on where, we miss the how. And quality assurance should focus on the integrity of the assessment and the clarity of that learning path for that individual learner, regardless of the delivery vehicle.
And if we do that well, then online modality can actually give us better evidence of learning than a high stakes final exam on campus could do.
You're right, because flexibility should stop us from sliding into lower expectations.
Absolutely. I mean, the real story here, I think, is that flexibility and assurance of learning are not opposites or mutually exclusive.
In fact, it should allow us to maintain the rigor through governance with those standards. Assurance of learning is a nationwide challenge for all of us to solve, and it is encumbered by technological and pedagogical issues. So this really starts to elevate assurance of learning from a tick box exercise to a strategic governance tool.
Absolutely. And if you think as well with online learning, the synchronous and the asynchronous combined, we actually have an enormous number of data points that we can draw on to show that engagement of the students and to demonstrate their learning. So if online learning is intentionally designed that way, governed and supported, it can actually be one of the most rigorous and equitable forms of higher education, especially for those students who need it the most.
So the architectural design is the theory, but Karen, I'm curious to know how that actually feels for a 40-something career changer trying to navigate the system.
So these students are typically highly motivated. They want to change career. They want to make a difference in their lives, but they're time poor. So for me, when I look at my research into mid to late career changers, online learning offers an ability and an opportunity to change career, and that flexibility is key to that. So in my mind, assurance of learning actually matters more in that context, not less. So the question for me is, are we designing learning in a way that lets them regularly demonstrate what they know and the fact that they're building their capability over time?
Thanks, Karen. And that sort of raises that next point of what does good, active, asynchronous design actually look like? And I think we need to stop thinking about individual units and start thinking about a collective assurance framework. This means designing program level architecture where every touch point, synchronous or not, is a deliberate data point for evidence.
Yeah. So, Aaron, what do you think good, active, asynchronous design actually looks like in a typical week? And attached to that, I would say, and how does that actually strengthen assurance of learning?
So I guess a good design for asynchronous is based on a series of blueprints and storyboards that signal the key touch points throughout a unit. This could be a welcome post. This could be a range of discussion forum interactions. This could be an interactive learning activity that the student needs to complete. Now, without some systematic process behind those learning artifacts, it can be very disjointed. And I think this is where once you get into that learning design phase and really think through the touch points, you scaffold those elements throughout, that's where you start to have a strong weekly set of learning activities the student needs to complete.
Yeah, I agree. And then underpinning all that, we have the data as well, don't we? So at OES, we use data-driven systems to check the progress of students. So we can identify early on if somebody isn't as engaged as they could be or is struggling with the core content. And I think that's really important from an assurance of learning perspective, because that actually gives us a lot of data points around the engagement and learning journey of students.
And you're right, it is that deliberate data point for evidence. Without actually understanding where those touch points are, it's very hard to verify the learning outcomes and the engagement of that learner throughout a week of content.
I agree, Aaron. And also that allows for targeted interventions. So whether it's a check-in, a clarification video, or just a little nudge with some support. So from an assurance perspective, you can show that learning has been monitored and supported and evidenced, not just assumed.
As we said earlier, is that really by using the data in that environment, we can ensure that the patterns of engagement are tracked, that we can see where our students are falling at risk in a flexible cohort.
So if you look at how we intervene to support people and how we feed that into assurance of learning, particularly for career changers, The linear career no longer exists. People are not leaving school or TAFE or university and going straight into an organisation, serving their time to transcend up to the more senior levels. People are changing careers more frequently and more dramatically. So, for example, within our student body, we have accountants who want to become teachers or engineers who want to become nurses. It's really, really interesting. For career changes, authentic assessment, I believe, is often where the moment where things click. So many of these students haven't written an academic assessment for 10, 15 or 20 years. So the self-doubt can come in. But when a task asks them to analyse a realistic scenario, potentially make a professional judgment and apply the theory we're teaching them, they can relate that back to their real world. And that actually demonstrates learning, I feel, a lot more.
So I guess when we get to this, it is all about rooting things in workplace tasks. All right. And one of the problems we have in the assessment environment at the moment is that from a asynchronous mode, there's not a lot of opportunities for relational evidence. You catch up with your student on a fortnightly basis at most, because they are busy people, whether that's undergraduate or postgraduate students. But when you have assessments that allow the student's voice to come out, they get to share their experience, that's where we are having a robust level of learning, regardless of the context or discipline.
Yeah, and I think that your point there about linking the assessment back to real world scenarios is really important, because I think that links into student confidence. So if they can link their learning back to something that they perhaps have in their workplace, it gets over some of those barriers for more mature learners when they are returning to study.
And I think this sort of also lends itself to the intrusion of generative AI in our existing education environment. If you're starting to look at assessments that are localized, informed by professional judgment, you're not only appealing to the type of learner we're seeing come through, but the need for quality assurance at the institutional level.
Assurance shouldn't be about control. It's about being able to demonstrate what's happening and to be able to respond intelligently to that.
And look, it doesn't take a lot, all right? Moving away from a high-stakes exam that generally just tests rote memorization, you can audit a real-world task in a simulated environment. This could include analysing live data, creating a briefing paper that they present to the executive audience, and being able to reflect on their practice through that process. It is these ways in which we're able to garner relational evidence, because the assessor can see the student's thinking, their ability to apply that thinking, and the way in which they have used their professional judgment over time.
Yeah, and from a retention perspective, relevance of assessments actually drives persistence. So students are far more likely to stay when the assessments feel more meaningful to them rather than performative. And I think, we're all here to change students' lives. We'd like them to see them complete their degrees.
And it makes the student happy, but it also makes the regulator happy. We need to provide evidence of the learning, and this is where the authentic tasks allow for that. They instill the confidence in the student, and they have the ability to ensure learning throughout that process. And you're right, because we aren't just assuring quality, we're evidencing it through the design of the tasks themselves.
And adult learners or more mature learners, actually, they require that clarity. They are busy. They have other conflicting priorities in their lives as well. So that clarity around evidencing the learning, how assessments are designed, is actually what they need as well in order to succeed.
Correct. So, Karen, would you have any tips to recommend a dean or a course director on this topic?
So my first piece of advice would be to look hard at assessment design and ask, what evidence do we currently accept as a proof of learning, and is it still fit for purpose? Because if an assessment is authentic and well moderated, then modality actually should come into it far less, and it should be less scary from an assurance of learning perspective. And secondly, I'd invest in designs that make learning visible early and often for both students and staff. So this means low stakes activities, prior to census, structured interactions, and coming back to that data that supports human targeted intervention. Because Assurance shouldn't be about control. It's about being able to demonstrate what's happening and to be able to respond intelligently to that. Assurance of learning is something we need to solve as a sector across all modalities. It's not something that is just particular to online learning.
What Aaron and Karen have made so clear is that modality is not just a label. It is a design system. It's made up of pacing, interaction patterns, feedback loops, assessment formats, support structures, and governance arrangements. When aligned well, they can generate richer evidence than a simplistic same room, same time assumption. It is better design, stronger governance, and more connected evidence. Flexibility and rigour are not opposites. Connection matters more than modality. If this episode has shown that mode does not determine quality, the next question is what kind of curriculum and assessment design actually builds confidence in learning? In the next episode, we turn to pedagogical assurance, how courses themselves generate evidence of learning through scaffolded cumulative design. Thanks for joining us for this episode of The Thought Bubble. I'm Amanda Ford, and I hope you'll continue the journey with us.